Сейчас с новостями.
Подведем итоги сегодняшнего дня.
TV Rain, Дождь. The only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that.
There will be very serious consequences.
TV Rain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
Greetings, international viewers, and welcome to Russia Tomorrow, a project of TV Rain, Russia's only remaining independent news station. We speak to you here from our broadcast facility in Europe, but our focus remains on Russia and our mission has not changed. I'm Tikhon Zitko. Let's get started. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin annexed 4 Ukrainian territories in a Kremlin ceremony and officially redesignated the 7-month-long war of his choosing as an existential battle against the forces of evil. North Sea underwater explosions damaged the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines between Russia and Germany and sent more than 500,000 tons of dangerous methane into the atmosphere between the coasts of Denmark and Sweden. Russia denies responsibility for the environmental catastrophe and accuses the West of sabotage. As many as 700,000 Russians fled the country after last week's call by Putin and the defense minister for partial mobilization. But inside Russia, many who answered the draft soon found themselves in squalid conditions with inadequate supplies and defective equipment. Inclusion or annexation? What's the difference? Annexation is the formal act of a state that proclaims sovereignty over territory outside its domain. Inclusion is a word that means residents of the new territory desire to join their occupier. In the 4 territories of Ukraine recently annexed by Russia, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Lugansk and Donetsk, a sham referendum held at gunpoint during wartime is all the expression of desire that Putin needed to include those sovereign Ukrainian territories into Russia. And last week, he stood up in the ornate St. George Hall of the Kremlin and said Ukraine will not ever see them again.
Мы призываем киевский режим немедленно прекратить огонь, все боевые действия, ту войну, которую он развязал еще в 2014 году, и вернуться за стол переговоров. Мы к этому готовы. Об этом не раз было сказано. Но выбор народа в Донецке, Луганске, Запорожье и Херсоне обсуждать не будем. Он сделан. Россия его не предаст. И сегодняшние киевские власти должны относиться к этому свободному волеизъявлению людей с уважением, и никак иначе. Только таким может быть путь к миру.
Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said the 4 recently annexed territories, as well as the Crimean Peninsula, are still legally part of sovereign Ukraine, with no changes to their status.
There were no legal procedures here. It's still a standard case of occupied territory on which the occupying army is stationed, which can and should be destroyed as part of the allowed procedure for liberation. Ukraine has a mandate to do this. Therefore, throughout our territory, and I emphasize that Crimea, legally a sovereign territory of Ukraine, is included here, we can use all the weapons our partners provide us. Furthermore, these partners have also said that they consider these territories to be the territories of Ukraine.
Back at the Kremlin, Russia's political elite sat through the half-hour speech by the Russian president broadcast live on state TV, interrupting with applause numerous times as Putin sought to position himself over and over again as the leader of a country fighting the super empire of the United States and as the leader of the anti-liberal world.
США единственная страна в мире, дважды применившая ядерное оружие, уничтожив японские города Хиросиму и Нагасаки. Кстати говоря, создали прецедент. Напомню о том, что США вместе с англичанами превратили в руины без всякой военной необходимости во время Второй мировой войны Дрезден, Гамбург, Кёльн и многие другие немецкие города. И это было сделано демонстративно, без всякой, повторю, военной необходимости. Цель была только одна, так же, как и в случае с ядерными бомбардировками в Японии – запугать и нашу страну, и весь мир.
Later, the Kremlin put on a dazzling patriotic variety show and concert on the Red Square, bringing in hundreds of flag-waving supporters on chartered buses from regions around Moscow to celebrate the annexation with patriotic entertainers and help Putin cheer on Russian army troops.
Произойдет то, чего все ожидают. Рано или поздно мы победим. Гойда! Гойда!
With more on Putin's discordant Kremlin speech last week and its stark departure from reality, here's my colleague Ekaterina Katrikadze.
As Ukraine's armed forces were liberating their own territories, Vladimir Putin was putting the finishing touches on a great ceremony to celebrate their annexation. And while the Russian president and a Kremlin audience of VIPs and political elites were signing the unification documents, great chunks of the annexed regions were suddenly turning back under Kiev's control. For the Russian army, the war is a complete failure, a fact acknowledged on the deflated faces of propaganda representatives trapped by a plain truth. Since Friday, September 30th, when Putin made his annexation speech, the armed forces of Ukraine have re-established control over Liman and several more key settlements in both the Donetsk and Kherson regions. None of these facts can be interpreted as a victory. The head of Russia made serious attempts to try and repeat the success of 2014, an attempt at the repetition of literally everything. Same St. George Hall in the Kremlin, same thankful civil service and court officials in attendance, same music, and for all intents and purposes, the same narrative story. The same man who once spoke of the 20th century's greatest geopolitical catastrophe now mourns the Soviet Union.
То, что казалось невероятным, к сожалению, стало реальностью. СССР распался. В 1991 году в Беловежской пуще, не спрашивая волю рядовых граждан, представители партийных тогдашних элит приняли решение о развале СССР. Вопреки прямому волеизъявлению большинства людей на референдуме 1991 года, развалили нашу великую страну.
But now the stakes are different. Want to know who the enemy is, whom we're fighting against? There they are, the United States. Putin's Kremlin speech is the clearest demonstration of a definitive rupture in relations with the West. Look how different was the tone 8 years ago.
Сегодня я хочу обратиться и к народу Соединенных Штатов Америки, к людям, которые со времен основания этого государства, принятия Декларации независимости, гордятся тем, что свобода для них превыше всего. Разве стремление жителей Крыма к свободному выбору своей судьбы не является такой же ценностью?
Vladimir Putin's speech stinks of another failed attempt at creating a cohesive ideology. Against the backdrop of mobilization, a clear drop in approval ratings, and against a rising tide of unsettled murmurs, the Russian president is asking Russians to believe that Russia is in a history-making battle with evil and that any bloodshed is Washington's choice and not Moscow's.
Стоит напомнить Западу, что он начал свою колониальную политику еще в период Средневековья, а затем последовала мировая работорговля, геноцид индейских племен в Америке, разграбление Индии, Африки, войны Англии и Франции против Китая, в результате которых он был вынужден открыть свои порты для торговли опиумом. То, что они делали, подсаживали целые народы на наркотики, целенаправленно истребляли целые этносы, ради земли и ресурсов, устраивали настоящую охоту на людей, как на зверей.
He is asking them to believe that all the historical events of the last 2 centuries have led to this great and inescapable clash. It's a war, but not with Ukraine. This war is against all of Western civilization. If up until the declaration of mobilization, all of this nonsense about the concept of anti-Russia was Putin's party line, and the armchair warriors could shake their fists at Washington, then, under the current circumstances, these arguments against American racism won't find any resonance with the Russian people, because it fails to answer the basic question: why are we going to war? What for should we be obliged to kill and die? Even the odd gasp of horror that the corrupt Anglo-Saxons are lacking in spiritually seems utterly ridiculous.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы у нас здесь, в нашей стране, в России, вместо мамы и папы был родитель номер 1, номер 2, номер 3? Совсем спятили уже-то. Разве мы хотим, чтобы в наших школах с начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию? Чтобы им вдалбливали, что кроме женщины и мужчины якобы существуют еще некие гендеры.
The average citizen of Russia is being asked to believe that he or any number of husbands, brothers and fathers are being sent to the front for the sake of traditional family. Moreover, the impression is being created that the commander-in-chief is hinting at something larger, reminding his audience in oblique terms of nuclear strikes, promising, quote, to defend our land with all available ways and means. What is he hinting at? Putin proclaimed an expansion of the already vast territory of Russian Federation at the time of the gravest internal political crisis. Just look at what has happened with him and the whole country in the last 7 months. First, an invasion of Ukraine in the hopes of a lightning raid to capture the capital. Then, a retreat from Kiev and concentrated battles in the south and east, along with expanded activity in the Donbass. But then another retreat, and now the declaration of a so-called partial mobilization. In the studied opinion of many military experts, the forced deployment of hundreds of thousands of men to the war will not help. These warriors have no skills, no experience and no ammunition. But none of these facts mean that the President of the Russian Federation will accept reality in all its hopelessness and suddenly retreat.
Наши ценности – это человеколюбие, милосердие и сострадание.
The kindness and love for humanity that the Russian president possesses are not so limitless that weapons of mass destruction are off the table. According to the Times, Putin is planning to conduct nuclear exercises in the Black Sea in extreme proximity to the Ukrainian borders in order to demonstrate his willingness to use nuclear weapons. And so, obviously, in response, the USA will launch strikes against military targets inside Russia. What happens after that is an unguessable hellscape. But luckily, this is not the only possible scenario. We see how the Kremlin consistently declares its desire to sit at the negotiating table. Somewhere out there in the corridors of the Kremlin's towers are people who still very much want to leave.
Russia tomorrow.
As fear now begins to settle in among some of the intended audiences of Putin's annexation speech, does it mean we now find ourselves entering a new phase of the war, where an isolated and incapable Russia finds itself unable to physically defend regions it now claims for itself and turns instead to nuclear strikes? On this and more about Putin's annexation speech, we are now joined with Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School in New York City. Nina, thanks for joining me here. If I may, my first question is that in the past few days, the Times has published information that Russia will soon conduct nuclear weapons testing. And we heard Putin himself recently. He said that he is not bluffing when he insisted that Russia may take action with any and all of its weapons arsenal. So what do you think? Is he bluffing or not when it comes to nuclear weapons?
We don't know. I mean, he's the only man who knows whether he's bluffing or not. I want to quote Olaf Scholz, who just said that he doesn't want to speculate whether Russia is going to use nuclear weapons or is not going to use nuclear weapons. I'm also sure that you saw something that was confirmed this morning. They got back to their, maybe yesterday, they got back to their agreement, the five-nation agreement on in January, that they're determined not to use nuclear weapons. So I actually thought that this was a sign of a little bit of a blinking, because there'd been so much conversation about whether he will, whether he won't, and so on, and therefore it seems that they decided to put forward some sort of a kind of consolation for everybody to chill, to calm down. But of course, you know, when the president in a variety of speeches now mentions, Russian president mentions that he's not going to he's not going to have anything off the table. Of course, there's going to be a huge discussion, but I hope that he is warning and bluffing. On the other hand, by now, we've seen that if Putin says he's going to do something, he actually does this. And the fear is that it seems to me that if he has some sort of set of tools on the table, he may be wanting to use them if he needs to.
If we think that he may use it, is it a big discussion in the United States right now? Because I saw the recent interview of Mr. Sullivan from National Security Council, where he was telling that this possibility exists. What would be the reaction from the United States? Mr. Biden and other representatives of the U.S. government, they've been insisting that the U.S. is not and will not be a part in this conflict. But if Kremlin actually uses nuclear weapon, what will be the reaction? What do you think?
Well, they also say, the White House has been saying quite consistently that they don't think that Russia will use nuclear weapons. They also say that they don't see any preparation for Russia to use nuclear weapons. Right. So they consider it, they consider it a bluff. But of course, they have to take this into serious account. Some of the discussion that I've been reading and hearing in the United States, it's that the United States doesn't really need to use nuclear weapons. In fact, it's perfectly capable, if Russia does use nuclear weapons, perfectly capable of shutting down all sorts of Russian potential, what just was with regular weapons. And in the last 7 months, Putin has shown, the Russian army has shown that it's a rather inadequate instrument. I mean, you know, he probably now, they may think that they should not be doing this, because then everybody was afraid. In February, nobody is afraid of the Russian army anymore. So the United States doesn't think that it needs even to use nuclear weapons to shut Russia down. And I think that would, as Olaf Scholz said, I don't want to speculate. I don't know, because this is really a discussion that is highly hypothetical. Still, the United States may be able to confront Russia on this. Russia becomes a country that uses nuclear weapons. The United States does not, which certainly then damages Russian, if we survive, damages Russia's reputation. More in the United States actually acts in a responsible fashion. So of course, Putin would say, and he already said that the United States used the nuclear weapons already in Japan, and therefore, almost as if therefore Russia can't do this. But still, I think we're a little bit some way to go to get to this, to an actual conversation.
What do you think about Putin's speech on last Friday when he was announcing the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian regions? How did you find it? Was it interesting to you listening to Mr. Putin's speech?
It was, and Tikhon, you and I have been for years talking about propaganda. So I like a good propaganda speech, and I'm very open to beautiful connection of unconnectable things. But I have to say, this was a very disappointing speech. It almost felt, and we discussed this before, but kind of the Putin popularity was almost like he was James Bond of contemporary Russia, doing all this fancy stuff and all this stuff that James Bond does. And somehow I think he sort of played it and sort of got into his head, because James Bondiana usually does, got into his head, and he just got into an absolute James Bond villain. I was listening to this piece like, wow, that was just, every single James Bond villain mashed in one thing, with the grandiosity of arguments, with the imperial something. Also, as you've heard, we are now apparently were slaves of the West, and also the wonderful thing is that apparently we were the victim of colonialism, while we are an empire and there are colonies that we still try to colonize. So it was one of those moments that even I, who love a good propaganda speech, just felt like, you know what, you are not delivering, because the contradictions. I mean, for example, Ivan Ilyin, the philosopher that he loved so much, who, as you know, lived in Switzerland and was considered the agent of Joseph Goebbels, and then Putin so talks about Ivan Ilyin and then says, oh, and the sanctions and the lies about Russia, they're on par with Goebbels, all these lies that Goebbels lived. Like, I'm sorry, this is just so George Orwell 2022, like we've never seen in real life.
How would you explain the obsession Mr. Putin has with history? In this speech, he was again speaking a lot about history, and in particular, there is some sort of an obsession with Nikita Khrushchev.
Yeah, well, I mean, Khrushchev is a very easy target for him, because he doesn't look like power. He never pretended to look like power. He actually probably, I mean, I'm probably biased. Actually, I'm not biased. One of the few leaders the Soviet Union ever had who cared about people. I mean, I was thinking today about potential famine in 1963. There was very poor grain crop, and he bought grain from Canada and the United States, and then he was just being slaughtered for this. And he said, "No, don't slaughter me, because I don't want people to starve the way it would have been, or it was in 1932 and 1946." So he does have this thing that Khrushchev was sort of a weakling. But this whole thing about colonialism, I thought was interesting, because our country was the first which addressed colonialism, and we spoke for all these other nations. In fact, it was Khrushchev who spoke for all these other nations. He was the one who addressed the issue of colonialism in 1960. Of course, he didn't get a name mentioning. So yes, I think Putin is sort of this hobby historian who pulls out historical narratives the way they suit him. And we know that from many leaders, and especially dictatorial leaders, because they look at history as a guide to their future. I mean, we know that about Putin. I mean, suddenly all this, the statues to Vladimir the Great, the statue to Ivan the Terrible, suddenly being erected as sort of this predecessors of Putin, of Putin the Great. So he does have that thing, but unfortunately, I mean, I think he just learns wrong lessons from history, if one can learn. I mean, let's take the Cuban Missile Crisis. If he's so obsessed with Khrushchev, remember Cuban Missile Crisis got resolved in 13 days, because when both leaders realized that the world's fate at stake, the humanity is at stake, they immediately figured out a way to handle it. And in fact, Khrushchev got what he wanted out of Kennedy, the missiles out of Turkey. American missiles out of Turkey, but it wasn't secret, because Kennedy was afraid to lose his reputation to the Republicans. He was a Democratic president, Democrat president, and Khrushchev agreed. So he was absolutely ready to take a hit with his reputation for the sake of humanity. Clearly, Putin is not ready at all.
Bad lessons of history, that sounds about right. Thank you so much, Nina Khrushcheva, Professor of International Affairs at the New School in New York City.
Russia tomorrow.
No explanation other than a pre-planned attack. That's what sources close to an official investigation told journalists from the German newspaper Tagesspiegel about explosions last week that crippled 3 underwater pipelines meant to carry natural gas from Russia to Germany. 3 ruptures overnight in the North Sea on September 26th brought a significant drop in pressure to monitoring stations for Nord Stream, 2 sets of twin pipes that run to a length of about 1,200 kilometers each. Half of Russia's gas imports to Europe came through Nord Stream 1, while Nord Stream 2 was complete but not yet operational after Germany withheld its certification following the invasion of Ukraine. Western authorities are cautiously describing the destruction of Nord Stream as a sabotage of critical infrastructure, without naming suspects, and North Sea maritime countries Denmark, Sweden and Norway have all raised their military patrols in the region. According to Tagesspiegel, the only way to coincide multiple explosions on multiple pipelines in at least 2 different places at the same time is with underwater divers or a submarine. The newspaper goes on to say that investigators are looking into 2 versions of events. In one, Ukraine or pro-Ukrainian forces are behind the explosions, while in the second version, it is Russia that stands responsible. Independent energy analyst Sergei Vakulenko said the odds of 3 simultaneous ruptures at the same time are astronomically high, and that all signs point to human activity.
I'm really a specialist in oil and gas, and not in military sabotage and diversion strategies, so it's difficult for me to say anything specific on this front. What I will say is that leaks in pipelines like this are incredibly unlikely. There are official documents put together by the Nord Stream operator, Nord Stream AG, which estimate the probability of an event like the one that happened. They say that the likelihood of such an event is 1 in 10,000 or even 100,000 years.
While Danish authorities now say that the leak from Nord Stream 1 has finally stopped, the release of more than 500,000 tons of methane into the atmosphere in just a few days is equivalent to the yearly carbon emissions of a city the size of Paris.
Methane isn't a toxic gas, but it is a very potent greenhouse gas, so global warming will say, thank you very much. Those who aren't fans of global warming won't be too happy, but it's just a drop in the ocean in the grand scheme of things. One string of Nord Stream 2, which has never entered service, remains functional. Either the explosive device on it malfunctioned, or the people who masterminded this intentionally left it alone, or something else happened. We don't know, but it's still there. I haven't heard any news about scuba divers scoping out the pipelines, and most likely I think there were no scuba divers at all. Sending a vessel with scuba divers on it at the moment would be risking lives. It would be madness, and I don't think anyone would do it.
On Friday, Putin accused the USA of pipeline sabotage during his Kremlin annexation speech, a claim Washington quickly rejected. And on Wednesday, Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev explicitly named the CIA and said the sabotage of the Nord Stream offshore gas pipelines resembled the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency-backed attacks on oil infrastructure in Nicaragua in 1983. Still, the Kremlin insists that no explanation can be excluded, while in Kiev, authorities said the goal of pre-planned terrorism from the Russian side is to destabilize the economic situation in Europe and create panic ahead of winter.
Russia tomorrow.
In Afghanistan, in Chechnya and in Syria, the Russian army fought its wars to various effect without the need for a nationwide mobilization. In fact, such enormous sacrifice and assistance from the Russian people has never been requested by authorities since World War II. But now with the war in Ukraine, Russia is facing a troubling set of challenges to the ties between its people and its leadership as mobilization begins to fall apart and propaganda starts to collapse. In a village in the Kemerovo region, all 59 men of draft age were taken away. In other parts of Russia, men over 55 and boys under 18 are handed draft notices and told to report. Multiple examples of medically exempt, physically disabled people with chronic illness and even legal blindness being sent off to be processed and drawing enormous attention on social media. In the Sverdlovsk region, a draftee committed suicide at his training center, and now there are multiple verified reports of recruits dying before they even reach the front.
Yes, I can confirm there are already 3 deaths. 1 recruit died of a heart attack, 1 committed suicide, and the 3rd had been exempted and sent home, where he died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Local media from the neighboring Chelyabinsk region reported that the 3rd victim, 44-year-old Denis Kozlov, slept on a bus outside the training center with other recruits after arrival, but was then sent home, where he did in fact die, but not from a liver disease.
A squabble escalated into a fight, and my brother got hit in the head and fell. The enlisted soldier kicked him a few times, and then they separated. On the 28th of September, the medic sent my brother home with a ticket that said unfit for medical reasons. On the night of the 29th, he came home, but then he began to feel unwell. He slept and started to feel better, but then on the 30th lost consciousness for the first time, but we thought it was stress. After an hour, he fainted again, and then passed out a 3rd time with the doctors. They took him to the hospital, and there he began to feel better and refused to be hospitalized because Mum would be worried that he just avoided mobilization and should go home. I drove him 10 kilometers home, and on the way he began coughing up blood.
Recruits themselves are sending back self-made videos to their loved ones, later shared widely, of what was not being shown on state TV. Men sleeping in buses, men sleeping outdoors on cold, hard ground, men in barracks with no electricity or running water, holding unusable rifles and inadequate equipment, being urged by local officers to buy their own protective gear and medical supplies to take to the front in Ukraine. Regional political leaders have been aggressively trying to counteract the negative effects of a poorly organized mobilization, defending large and successful enterprises that employ hundreds of military-aged men from being emptied out by opportunistic and even lazy draft officers seeking to fill their mandated quotas. In some places, this means organizing charity food drives for families left without a male wage earner. In remote Tuva, families were compensated for the absence of their sons and fathers with a sheep for slaughter and a supply of potatoes. On Sakhalin Island on the Pacific Ocean coast, families of mobilized soldiers will get 6 kilograms of freshly frozen fish in compensation for their loss of income. And across Russia, the federal government says it will pass new laws to give financial assistance in the form of credit holidays and even cancel loan interest payments for as long as soldiers are deployed.
Так вот, в раковине для мытья ног это простые умывальники.
У нас в расположении ни кровати, ничего нету.
Даже палатку с печкой не дали. Ночуйте в поле и пофиг.
Вон костры.
Russia Tomorrow.
Thank you for watching Russia Tomorrow, and thank you for subscribing to our international channel. With your financial support, we continue to monitor what happens in Russia so that we can deliver the truth to our audience inside the country and around the world. Please help us with your cash donation to our GoFundMe page in the description below. I'm Tikhon Zitko. I'll see you soon again.